It's my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Peter Pomerantsev, who is one of the world's foremost experts on disinformation and propaganda. He's the author of Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, Adventures in Modern Russia. And This is Not Propaganda, Adventures in the Wars Against Reality, among other works. This year, Peter was also awarded with the European Press Prize. So Peter is just completing his final notes to his speech, but a warm welcome.
Yeah, I had to rewrite it all after your intro. Thank you very much all for coming. For those of you who haven't read all my books, I think one at least is available in Finnish. But I have a very odd background. My background actually is in, nowadays writing books, but before that I was in making very popular TV programs, sort of 7 p.m. kind of style reality shows, which is how I wasted my youth. And I did that in Russia, just when the Russian TV industry was booming in the first decade of Putinism, which gave me a chance to see this sort of very strange and powerful new model of propaganda that was emerging under Vladimir Putin, and that was what my first book was about, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. In my second book, This is Not Propaganda, I tried to look at what Russia was doing with propaganda and relate it to problems across the world, and a little bit about my family's past. I'll get into that in a second. And then I kind of realized that I didn't just want to describe the problem, which is the same problem that you're talking about today. How can democracy survive in an era of disinformation gone mad? I wanted to do something about it. And so for some reason I thought the place to do that from was academia. I don't know why I made this connection, but I felt we needed a space to experiment with new ideas and test new approaches. And that's what I've been doing the last few years at the London School of Economics, now at Johns Hopkins University. I run a little laboratory where we work with media, put them together with sociologists, and try to think about how do you create media that actually overcomes some of the pathologies of our public sphere. Now, I say that because I think everybody here probably has their own way into really what is one problem. I focused largely on this problem of hostile states like Russia, starting with the challenge of disinformation. But as I went deeper and deeper and deeper into this topic, I really found that we're talking about something much more structural. I'm talking about essentially the sort of structural disintegration of the public sphere, which is really related to this much larger debate that we're having, or have been all having since 2016, about the crisis of democracy. If you go into a bookshop in Washington or in London, it'll be wall to wall with books about, the death of democracy, the almost death of democracy, how to save democracy from certain death. And it's easy to laugh at that, but it's also very true. I think we all feel that democracy, as we knew it, is going through a profound crisis. There are authoritarian movements and authoritarian states which make a quite coherent argument that in a complex world of globalization, democracy is too slow, too messy, it's inefficient. Only the Chinese or the Russian model will do. And usually when we think about this crisis of democracy, we think about it in terms of trust to institutions, we think about trust to courts and the belief in justice, we think about elections, but I think we've also started to have to grapple with this question of democratic discourse or the public sphere. I think you mentioned this term, and we realize we don't really know very much about it. We sort of have all these kind of like assumptions about deliberative democracy, that we'll all talk to each other and come to decisions, but how is that meant to happen? What is the relationship between information and democracy? And that's kind of really what I've come to sort of dwell on, and how can we imagine a public sphere for a digital age. And in order to kind of make sense of that, I found it quite useful to go back to the past a little bit, to try to work out what are the assumptions that we used to have about how democratic discourse is meant to work, and what's gone wrong today. So in my last book, which is available at all good bookstores and on Amazon, I found it necessary to go back to my family's history. Not because I wanted to write a self-indulgent family memoir, but because my parents were at the sharp edge of the fight between a dictatorial information environment and a democratic one. So I was born in the Soviet Union, in Soviet Ukraine, in Kiev, and my parents were Soviet dissidents. So thankfully I'm in Finland, I don't have to explain what that is. A lot of environments you have to actually explain what that is and go through a whole history of the Soviet Union, the dissident movement, but I think that's not necessary here. They weren't famous dissidents. All my father did was give copies of the Gulag Archipelago to his friends, or Nabokov's Invitation to a Beheading. These were obviously banned books in the Soviet Union where it still shocks me, you would get 12 years for doing this. 7 years prison plus 5 years internal exile, usually in Mordovia or Siberia, for giving people books. He'd also signed the odd human rights letter. So for this very, very low-level activity, he was arrested and interrogated for many months. You'll have to read the book to find out what happened to him. But the reason I tell his story and that of my mother is because there's a sort of concentration there of the struggle, the 20th century struggle between a dictatorial information environment and a democratic one. So when I describe my parents' story, I kind of highlight what their information environment looked like. Obviously, they were fighting for freedom of expression versus censorship, which was the really simple way that we defined this tension. The dictatorships had censorship, you weren't allowed to read things, you were arrested for reading books, while democracies had freedom of expression. And that was the great tension between the two. But there's more to it than that. I mean, in the evenings, my father would try to sort of listen in to Radio Free Europe and the BBC, which were jammed on the radios. You had to sort of take the radio and like lean like this and wiggle it to sort of get a little bit of information through the shortwaves. And again, this is the search for pluralism versus a sort of a single state media. Democracies had pluralism. It was messy, it was chaotic, but that was meant to contribute to a greater debate and better democracy, while dictatorships had one media. And implicit in that is the idea, very powerful idea, that the powerful are scared of truth. Yeah, that the Soviet leadership and dictators they're like vampires who had to hold off the truth like a cross or like garlic, the garlic of truth. And when you held the garlic of truth, you held truth to power, and the powerful fell. And people were ready to sacrifice themselves from it. They were ready to go to prison for this sense that you could speak truth to power. And also, I suppose there was a dream there as well, that we could integrate information from across borders, that it would flow freely across the world, and that would bring a global information environment with it that was so different to the information walls and the physical walls put up by dictatorships. And in the book, I kind of go back to these concepts and realize how all of them have been undermined by a new form of authoritarianism, which has learned to exploit what we thought were the guarantors of a democratic public sphere. Now, across the world, people are still being censored. You know, there is still definitely a fight between censorship and free expression. There's one happening in Russia right now. It happens in Burma, in North Korea. But in a lot of environments, it's not really about that anymore. That's not the essence of the battle. And in the Russia that I lived in, as Putin was building up his propaganda model, it was much less about censorship. It was much more sort of about overloading the information environment with catastrophic amounts of disinformation. In the book, I tell the story of Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. She wasn't a Nobel Peace Prize winner then. I got a sense that she was a bit special. And her battles in the Philippines, where she as a journalist was attacked less through censorship, but by these armies of bots and trolls who were all covertly controlled by the state, and who just destroyed trust in her and her publications, created an environment where advertisers pulled out because they became so toxic. They were accused of being CIA stooges and traitors and spies and so on and so forth. So destroyed her business model, destroyed trust towards her and the truth. But whenever she would complain about this, the government and its allies would say, we're not censoring you. This is more information. Bots and trolls have rights as well. You guys always wanted more information. Well, here it is. And it's a cynical argument. But legally, there is no such thing as disinformation. There's nothing in the UN Declaration of Freedom of Expression, Article 19, about disinformation. There's the right to access information and the right to distribute information. Yeah? Legally, the very cynical neo-authoritarians are completely right. Yeah? We don't have a philosophical or legal concept that battles the idea that there's too much information. Our battle was always against scarcity. And even pluralism, which is meant to be such a guarantor of democracy, has turned out to be a double-edged sword. I live in the USA, which is a country which is definitely very pluralistic. Lots and lots of voices, but modeled in such a way that we've seen pluralism tip over into polarization that's so extreme and so vicious, the potential for a public sphere, which would always kind of presuppose that you would listen to the other side and debate with them and engage with them and reach some sort of, if not compromises, at least some sort of common rules with them, is now under threat. Complete stasis in Congress and divides in society so deep, there is real fear of a virtual civil war spilling into a kinetic one. And going further, all the things that my parents fought for, of all of them we mentioned truth, speaking truth to power as being absolutely vital. Maybe the soul of it in many ways. But nowadays, when you hold up the garlic of truth to a Putin or a Trump, I can think of some Scandinavian politicians as well, they don't care. Truth doesn't matter to them. They're like, yeah, I'm lying, so what? Who cares? They seem completely and utterly uncaring about the power of truth. And meanwhile, this dream of information flowing across borders has become deeply corrupted and has become a source of fear and insecurity with the preponderance of what's often known as information warfare, which exploits the potential of flowing across borders in order to undermine democracies in different countries. Obviously in Finland, you're at the front line of this issue, though I did hear a couple of Finns telling me yesterday how they were slightly disappointed that Russia hasn't really launched a big disinformation campaign around NATO accession. They're kind of distracted at the moment. Don't worry, they'll be back. All these underlying principles that were meant to guarantee a democratic information environment are now under question. And behind that, I always feel as if I'm walking through this kind of wasteland of broken metaphors. I mean, we used to have these metaphors like a marketplace of ideas, that there's a magic marketplace of ideas that will magically produce wonderful debates. It'll be robust and chaotic and all these things. But the best ideas will rise to the top through some theory of rational choice. I mean, it was a mad idea. Everything we know about human psychology, about how we interpret information, about biases, about identity, points to the fact that it's not how people integrate reality and information. We've known about this for many, 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 many decades. And yet we had this bizarre metaphor about how things were meant to work, which now seems almost like a piece of medieval superstition. So even the way we think and describe the public sphere has collapsed. So what are we going to do about it? I was criticized in my last book, not criticized, that it was too depressing, that I don't offer enough solutions. So since I finished my last book, which was a couple of years ago, I've been very much intent on the solutions. And I do think there are things that we can do, but I do think we have to start thinking about this in a very systemic way and a very coherent way. I think we have to think about regulation. We have to think about design. We have to reinvent media. And we have to come up with our own response to the information war being waged by Russia, by Iran, by China, and by extremist groups throughout the world. So let's start with regulation. There is not so much regulation we can or should have in democracies around the information environment. I do get a little bit, not so much nervous, because I don't think it's dangerous. I just think it's pointless when we start trying to regulate disinformation. Chasing after every piece of content, going, ha-ha, we've caught you, evil lie, go to prison, or something like that. And the Germans tried to do this in their first legislation around disinformation, trying to catch every piece of content. That's using a broadcast model for a digital age. I would love to call Facebook and say, my in-laws are talking crap again on Facebook. Can you do something about this? I'd enjoy that. Maybe they'd enjoy doing it to me as well. But it's ridiculous. The amount of content produced on social media, chasing after every piece of false content, is not practical, and probably also an infringement of many civil liberties. There's something much more systemic going on when we think about regulation. And the way I imagine it, because I'm not a lawyer, and I've had to start thinking about these things, it really becomes very clear when you bring it down to one's experience online as a democratic citizen. So we live in this paradox where there's more information than ever before, but less information than ever before about how that information is created, generated, targeted, organized. So in a way, it used to be easier. I grew up in Britain. I would know who was behind every newspaper. I knew the owner, usually Rupert Murdoch, in most cases Rupert Murdoch. I knew their biases, their interests, so I could have a critical engagement with the media around me. I could respond as a citizen and go, okay, the Times is saying this, the Telegraph's saying this, the BBC thinks this, so I could have an interaction with it. I could have, this critical thinking that we all want, this media literacy. But you can't be critical, not truly critical, of a black box. And at the moment, when I go online, I have no idea who is behind information. I have no idea why algorithms show me one thing and not another. I have no idea who's paying for the things that I'm seeing. I have no idea which of my own data is being used to target me. I'm completely in the dark. That, for me, is an infringement of freedom of expression, because freedom of expression isn't just about delivering information, it's about receiving it. The whole system is structured around a lack of transparency, in a way, I think. Disinformation, in the sense of denial to your share in reality. We can't engage with it as critical citizens without this basic information. Even something like fact-checking, some of the best fact-checking initiatives in the world are based in Finland. It's very hard to do it with any kind of real efficiency and intentionality if you don't know where the disinformation campaigns are being targeted. We have to know who is being targeted, what's working, before we can start any really, really successful interventions. So that's, I think, has to be the guiding principle of all the regulation as we move forward. Start with the rights of the citizen. and immediately a whole row of, I think, very sensible and very possible regulatory principles appear. We have to have access and understanding of how and why the algorithms work. You as a citizen have to understand who is targeting you and why and with what money. You have to know how they're targeting the person next door. You have to understand, I suppose it's like seeing the backstage of what's going on online. Then we can start engaging with it as democratic citizens, and I don't think that in any way is an attack on anybody's civil liberties. This is a request for more information. But again, there's only so much regulation can ever do in a democratic information environment. We don't want to regulate our way out of this problem. That's just not how democracies work. So let's think about the next challenge, this challenge of polarization. This is the main thing that I study at Johns Hopkins and the LSE. And again, I found myself going back to the past. This is not the first time we've had this problem. When radio appeared at the start of the 20th century, there was a very similar reaction to the internet. It's very funny reading, actually there was poetry written about this. You know, a lot of poets were very enthused, saying, my God, radio is going to bring humanity together. There will be no more wars because people will be able to hear each other across borders, and they will never fight again. We will have perpetual peace thanks to the radio, which reminds me a little bit of, the idea that the internet will connect everyone and we will have a lovely global village. So you have this euphoria, and very quickly the people who work out how to use this are Hitler, Stalin, and obviously they turn radio into a tool of extremist speech and a tool of totalitarian ideologies. And it takes a while for democracies to respond. So if you read the autobiography of Lord Reith, who created the BBC, this is what he's thinking about. He's like, okay, how do we use radio for democracy? How do we overcome the dictators? And also, he was writing about polarization in Britain, which was divided between tabloids and owned by tabloid oligarchs. How do we balance this out? And his vision of for the BBC, and again, I think the Nordics actually get this the best. This is something that's completely missed in Southern Europe and in America, where I live. His idea for the BBC is that it's not just public service in the sense of doing boring science programs. What he means is that the BBC's aim is to create a public sphere. He talks about the agora of ancient Athens, the space in Athens where in the evenings, Athenians, okay, male Athenians, slave-owning Athenians, but still, Athenians would meet and debate the great policies of the day. Do we go to war with Sparta? Do we not go to war with Sparta? Do we go to war with Sparta? Do we not go to war with Sparta? That was the main debate. And vote on it. This idea of a public space where deliberative democracy happens. And so Reith is thinking very much about the BBC as having that mission. How do you create media which does this? So I think we need a new generation of civic, public service media. I can't say public service media in America. If you do that, you lose your green card, basically. You can't say the words public service, that's socialist. So in America, I always go Tocquevillian media, civic media, but whose aim is to get up in the mornings and think about how do I bring different voices together in these interactions, through storytelling, through debates, through many, many, many tools. It's not hard. We've done lots of experiments in different countries where even talking about a subject like migration, there's ways of talking about it that will not get rid of polarization. Polarization is fine when it's constructive, but do it in such a way that people do start to engage, listen to each other and debate, where they don't dehumanize each other in the debate. And you can do it through many, many, many tools, through constructive news, solutions-orientated news, which drives people towards thinking about solutions, for example. There are many, many different ways. There's no one way to do this, but the point is getting up in the morning and wanting to do this. And here we get into the next problem, which is the design of the digital environment, because that largely forces media to do the opposite. We did a large project with an Italian publication, I won't say which one, about how they might approach a subject like migration. How could you write about migration in ways that would bring society around a common debate? And at the end of the project, the editor said, this is fascinating, really interesting experiments. We have shown how you create less toxic debates by using different clever editorial innovations. But this is not going to sell us ad tech revenue. We survive on ad tech. Yeah? We survive on advertisements which have to do well on Facebook and Twitter. That's how we survive. In order to do that, we make things as polarizing as possible. Yeah? We will publish op-ed after op-ed by people on the far right and on the far left, and that will drive ad tech engagement. And that's because the social media models reward polarization. They're designed quite consciously in ways to drive engagement, essentially by, fostering group psychology and group dynamics. You go online looking for likes and shares, which are most easily gained in a group by taking the most extreme position. That's how you generate attention for yourself, and that's how the whole attention economy is organized. The algorithms are organized around stimulating that sort of behavior. So even when we develop editorial techniques that could support a more productive public sphere, they get stymied by a design and an advertising model that undermines it. Now, we could think about alternative forms of funding, and I know in countries like Finland and other Nordic countries, there is a tradition of public funding for media. That's one way. In a lot of countries, that's just not an option. So we have to think about spaces which have a different type of model. We have to think about the very design of the online environment. So one metaphor that I heard used by Eli Pariser, who's an American sort of visionary of the internet, is to think about the internet in terms of a city. So at the moment, if the internet were a city, it would be a bit like the city out of Blade Runner. If you've seen the movie Blade Runner, 3 or 4 huge companies own the city. You can't tell who's real and who's a robot. And then you have a kind of a dark net, a sort of underworld of crime and nefariousness. And if we think about the ideal internet city of the future, it should have public spaces. It should have the digital equivalent of parks and libraries, and spaces which aren't dominated by a model of getting your attention, sucking your data, and then selling it to somebody. So I think the idea is to start thinking about what would be a social media model that actually benefits public debate. We know that what it wouldn't have. It wouldn't be modeled around sucking your data. It wouldn't be modeled around selling your data. It wouldn't reward polarization. There was actually an idea at the BBC, I think already in the early 2000s, saying we need to design the BBC equivalent of social media. What would it look like? What would this healthy environment be where we can interact and debate? What would the digital agora look like? And this might be fake news. This is just a rumor that I heard hanging out with BBC strategists, was that when that idea was pitched at the Blair government said, no, that's going to get in the way of the digital economy and these new exciting companies. We don't want you guys to intervene in a market-based model for the digital sphere. Looking back, it was a disastrous moment. We could have had, in Britain at least, a path where we had a space to debate our politics that was not based on the logic of Facebook and Twitter. So looking for those new design spaces is another very, very important moment. But again, I don't think we can purely design our way out of this issue. So we talked about regulation, we talked about design. And how do we answer this much deeper cultural crisis, which says that that truth doesn't matter? How do you respond to leaders in democracies and dictatorships who don't care about the truth? And even though I would love to blame everything on Mark Zuckerberg, I can't. I remember living in Russia in the early 2000s, and already there I saw a propaganda model develop which reveled in throwing off the value of truth. My first book was called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which sort of reflected the cynicism of a generation of Kremlin leaders who celebrated lying. They're like, yes, we lie and we're proud of it and we don't care about reality. When I saw Donald Trump emerge in the US and various types of European right-wing populists, I sort of gasped with recognition. I was like, I've seen this before. It wasn't just Putin. There's a whole generation of politicians like that, emerging through the 90s and coming to power in the 2000s. I remember talking to Russians at the time, going, what do you think of this pattern? Why are we seeing things that I saw in Russia in the 90s and early 2000s play out in the West? And they're like, you're finally catching up with us. We got to this place culturally first. And the argument they made, which an argument I think we have to take seriously, and this was one of Putin's spin doctors, one of the guys who helped create Putin, who argued this to me. He basically said that the idea of truth in political discourse is connected to rational ideologies of the future. So in the Cold War, the world that my parents were operating in and struggling in and risking their freedom in, truth mattered because we lived in a system where different ideologies made rational claims about the future. Communism claimed to be a scientific theory that was taking you somewhere, to socialist utopia. Democratic capitalism had implicit within it an idea of Enlightenment progress. And the argument they made was that when these systems and these ideas of the future collapsed, when they turned out to be not delivering any kind of promise, then suddenly evidence lost its attraction. Before, evidence was taking you somewhere. You were proving that you were getting somewhere. You were showing that your children looked better, that lived and looked better than you. Suddenly, all the facts were doing was telling you that your life was unpleasant, that your children will be poorer than you, that there is no progress. And that sort of happened in Russia very, very violently in the late 80s and early 90s. And their argument was that it was happening in a lot of the West, really post-2008. Yeah? The idea of the future disappeared for many people. Not for everybody, not for people living in the capitals, but people who were losing whole industries, whose status had been undermined due to social and economic change. For them, there was no sense of the future anymore, and so facts just became something that told you that you were going to die, get old, and that you were bankrupt. And so when politicians suddenly came along and said, fuck the facts, forgot this was recorded. It was attractive. Sticking a big finger up to reality was something that people enjoyed. I think there's something to this theory. Because if you think about what all these wave of politicians, from Bolsonaro through to Orban, Trump, and most powerfully Putin, and in his own way Xi Jinping, all have in common is that they're all nostalgists. Yeah? Looking at the Russian propaganda today and Putin's rationale for invading Ukraine, there's not a word about the future. Not a word. It's only about a mythical nostalgia for a non-existent past. That's the rationale for the invasion. Putin's rationale for invading Ukraine was he'd watched a couple of YouTube history videos and now he was going to invade. Yeah? That was literally it. It was like, Ukraine's always been part of Russia, Peter the Great, right, we're in. And it was fascinating living in Russia in the early 2000s, just seeing the future disappear from discourse. Disappeared. Only nostalgia and resentment, which is often the product of historical traumas that haven't been overcome. So everything is trapped around the past. So why this long excursion? The way to counter this is to generate conversations about a possible future. In a way, that's what the Ukrainians are doing with their blood. It's very interesting listening to Zelensky. All his speeches are about the future. We're going to do this. We're going to build this. Not a misty-eyed bullshit future, but a very much, a critical infrastructure future. These bridges, these schools, this is what we're going to do. And so while Ukraine drives towards a future, Russia is trying to pull it back into warped nostalgia. Now that sounds very, very, very philosophical. And philosophers can actually help here a little bit. But coming back to what I do, which is really thinking about media and storytelling, the question then becomes, how do we generate media, or how can media generate conversations where the future matters? How do we create digital spaces where the future becomes something that comes nearer to us? And I'll give you a couple of really small examples. I want to come down from this very, very, very abstract level to something very practical. So in the US, we have these highly entertaining and highly destructive primaries. When all the candidates for US president or just for the leadership of the Democratic or Republican Party, they debate each other on a big stage. Now, I suppose I share some guilt having worked in entertainment TV long ago. The way these are designed is the way we used to design reality shows. On purpose. Completely on purpose. It's also the way Facebook has become designed. And the principle is simple. This is what the producers tell the candidates. There's like 20 of you on your stage. Yeah? Your goal is to get some oxygen, to get yourself heard, because there's 20 candidates there. How are you going to get yourself heard? And what we tell them is you each have 20 seconds to speak. You can't speak longer than that. But if somebody answers you, and attacks you, you can respond again. Because you're allowed to respond to an attack. So we're doing that on purpose. We're stimulating low-level attacks. Because the best way then to get attention is to attack somebody in as nasty a way as possible, make them respond, that gives you another 20 seconds. Which is exactly how a reality show works. You're motivated in a reality show to attack someone, so they attack you back, you get to dominate the conversation. That's why reality shows are full of people attacking each other about the teacup in the house. Not everybody watches reality shows. You do deep down, don't you? Secretly. We set that. We've set those rules as producers in order to get them to fight. Because it's fun. But the result is, for democracy, remember in the last Democratic primaries, two of the brightest politicians in America, genuinely bright. I think it was Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg. Genuinely brilliant, with brilliant policy ideas, both of them borderline geniuses, were basically just standing there going, you're ugly, no, you're ugly, no, you're ugly, no, you're ugly. Because that was the only way for them to capture attention. We could design this in a different way. In a way that stimulated a conversation about the future, where facts mattered. We could say, here's a policy problem. Show us how you're going to work together to solve it. And show us how you're going to convince the other side to ever get this through Congress. So it's still competition, it's still fun, it's still, they can insult each other if they want, it doesn't matter. But it's stimulating a solutions-oriented approach where facts begin to matter again. When we talk about internet design, there's a wonderful project in Taiwan, Taiwan, where they've designed a platform, they've exploited a platform that was actually designed by some guys in Seattle, which is kind of the anti-Facebook. So it rewards finding consensus. Yeah? So it's a platform where you comment on a complex policy issue, taxi drivers versus Ubers, something that really actually riles society. But the way the debate is constructed, the way the design is constructed, it brings you closer together to the other side. You're rewarded in finding commonality. It filters out the comments that are the most extreme, and it finds the commonalities. So again, that's an example of design that's looking towards a solution where facts matter, where mutual insult and hatred are moved to the back of the shot. So we've talked about regulation. We've talked about design. We've talked about new media. Well, all these are building blocks for the future. I just want to end on one thing, which is how we're going to respond to the information war pushed by Russia, increasingly by China, Iran, ISIS. I think we're an early innovator in this space. And I know that Finland is on the front lines. I think we have to understand something very fundamental about the Russian approach to information war. Now, we all know the tools. You know them here better than anyone else. The troll farms, the conspiracy spewing state media, the weird, corrupt assets, very weird in Finland, and the sort of the wolf warrior diplomats spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories on social media. We all know the toolkit. It's always emerging, it's always changing, but there's more to it than just a toolkit. It's sort of a pseudo-philosophy. It sort of emerged when I lived in Russia. And it started off with a piece of historical revisionism. It started off by saying, we didn't lose the Cold War due to bad policies, bad ideas, all the things my parents fought for, democracy. We lost it because of information warfare from the West. An information operation called economic reforms was implanted like a virus in our society and pushed forward by a fifth column of reformers secretly trained by the CIA. And that brought down our society. That brought down the system. It wasn't the system was bad. It was we weren't. We were open. And we were manipulated with things that weren't ideas. They weren't concepts, they weren't philosophical arguments, because those things don't exist. All communication is manipulation. Yeah? That's what it started as. And then as Putin ran into trouble, as there were protests in Russia, as all these corruption investigations came out, the response was always the same. It's information war against Russia. There is no such thing as an investigation. There's no such thing as journalism. It's always a type of manipulation, and it's all information war. Now, what they're saying is actually quite insidious. What they're saying is a democratic public sphere can't exist. It doesn't exist a priori. There is no space for deliberation, because that means a democratic citizen that can weigh up the evidence, see the humanity of others. Information has a value as information. What they're saying is information cannot have a value as information because the democratic citizen doesn't exist. It's a myth dreamt up by the CIA. Actually, they're quite obsessed with MI5. It's really weird. But the Chinese are kind of saying the same thing. They're saying, give up all your data. We'll make all the decisions for you. Yeah? You give us all your online data, we'll find you the ideal home, the ideal city, the ideal wife, the ideal career. Freedom of choice is a myth. Both the Russians and the Chinese are actually making quite serious and systemic arguments saying that this thing called the public sphere and deliberative democracy is not only inefficient, look at America, that's what they say, but actually is a myth. So when we think about responding to Russia's information war and China's, what we're actually involved in is a debate about the possibility of democracy. Now, I don't know if there's strong ideological competition these days. Certainly not capitalism versus communism. Both Russia and China are capitalist. But it's almost as if
communications theory is the new ideological space, is the new battleground. What they're saying is the public sphere can't exist because people are just things to be manipulated. We have to respond in a way that not only reveals their troll farms, not only fact checks their disinformation, not only holds them accountable, I would like to think in courts of law, for their facilitation of war crimes. We have to do it in a way that shows the democratic subject exists. Now, I'm only just starting to think my way through this. But I can think of some principles already. They do troll farms, we do online town halls. Yeah. And I think we need to, right now, start a very large public information campaign into Russia. So far, we're in a very strange place in this war, which hangs over our conversations, where we've launched an economic special operation against Russia through sanctions, a diplomatic one through isolationism, all things that I support. I actually think they should go much further, without a public information campaign. We're letting Putin shape all the attitudes and all the behaviors around our policies which are meant to stop the war. It's insane. Imagine you did an economic reform policy and didn't do a public information campaign with it. But I think as we do that, and I hope we will start to do this, we have to think about the model of communication that goes along with it. The Kremlin is saying people are just there to be manipulated. How do we create a democratic communications infrastructure which is making the opposite argument and showing the opposite argument? So not preaching about democracy, because that gets you to sort of like freedom fries and propaganda about how great elections are, but actually a model of communication that shows that. My time is more than up. I've got a thing flashing at me. So I'll leave it on that pause, because frankly, I haven't worked it out either, but I know we have to go there, and I think Finland will have a very important role in helping us understand what that is. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. A lot of food for thought and 1,000 questions that
you won't get to ask.
Exactly, but
this is the sort of democracy I love. Like,
I know, but it's the kind of democracy that the audience doesn't get to ask except via Twitter. So please do put your Twitter discourse swinging, and we'll continue the debate here. But wonderful to have Jyrki and Alice with us, and as previously introduced, Jyrki has more than ample experience from public decision making and the whole change of the information environment, and we'll love to hear from you more. And Alice has been working on this for quite a while. So let's get the discussion going. And as we realize now, and as Peter mentioned quite a few times, this is something that we've been discussing and thinking about, how democratic policymakers around the world are wrestling with this concern of the pollution of the information environment, online radicalization, hate speech, and so forth. But often discussions about these problems are quite, honestly, I think they're simplified in that sense that they are framing the issue around information manipulation, and not their issue, what you, Peter, brought out, that our whole public sphere that we thought that we would always have has just suddenly disappeared, and there's no safe place as such to have the public debate or deliberate. I believe in one of your books you put it this way: it's not that the online account changes someone's mind, it's that en masse they create an artificial normality. And this is what I'm mostly worried about, is not that we are disagreeing on things, but we don't agree on the truth anymore either. So I would love to hear your thoughts, Alice and Jyrki. Please go ahead, Alice.
Yeah. Well, I agree that it's much more complex than that. It's not about true versus false, not about myth versus fact, not even about good guys versus the bad guys. Because more than about content, it's about online behavior, both of the human actors, but also of digital technologies. So yes, technology and digitization have brought us many good things. But after the early days of internet, we're now starting to see there are also negative effects on our societies. So, for example, there are many digital threats to democracy. We have digitally impaired cognition, there's reality apathy, weaponized information, polarization, compromised privacy, weakened media, digital authoritarianism, just to name a few. So what is happening, among other things, is that humanity is now inventing and deploying digital technologies that transform our societies in ways that we cannot handle. Our brains can't cope, and we, being social creatures, can't cope. So that's why we speak of an information disorder, and we must acknowledge that our information space is broken. We have a structural, systemic problem, which we need to fix as soon as possible.
Jyrki, your initial thoughts.
Thank you, Peter, for very inspiring presentation. It was very good. I liked your concrete points, or what are the things we should concentrate on keeping democracy alive. So I like the word liberal democracy, even though some people, especially politicians, don't like it because they want to be conservative. But in my view, being conservative doesn't mean that one should oppose liberal democracy, because in my view, liberal democracy means also that citizens have both rights but also responsibilities. And that's part of the democracy. So if you don't find ourselves as an actor in democracy, then we can easily start questioning the truth. So participation in democracy, or the sense of participation, is core. And that is one thing what we should consider or reconsider, how we could rethink democratic institutions so that we could enhance and strengthen the sense of being part of it. How we could use digital platforms for good. How digital environment could increase and strengthen participation instead of leading to more polarized societies. One anecdote about liberal democracy. I was in the closed event some 4 years ago where Viktor Orban was there. I was at the time the vice president of EPP party, and we invited Viktor, whose party was member of our party, to our presidency to talk about democracy and talk about his behavior. And he raised this liberal democracy as a problem because he said, I'm conservative and I'm Democrat. I win elections one after another, and I have all the legitimacy to do whatever I do, whatever I want. And we tried to explain to him that this is not the case. Democracy is much more than just winning the elections, and there are freedom of expression and free press and civil rights and liberties. Maybe my final point is that in liberal democracy we have lots of rules and laws, but in liberal democracy we cannot legislate everything. And for instance, we cannot prevent bad behavior by law, and that's quite problematic. But there is no kind of solution to this. We don't need necessarily new laws to prevent bad behavior, but somehow we need more transparency, because it's a core of democratic societies, and we need to regulate new tools, as you mentioned, Peter, new information tools to become more transparent. So we cannot regulate people's behavior more than saying that you can't steal or you can't kill another person. But making things more transparent, it gives an opportunity to argue and have a kind of constructive conversation.
Yeah, I think that both Jyrki and Peter both said that there's only that much regulation that we can do in a democratic society and democratic public sphere. But nevertheless, I'd like to ask you, since we know that there are huge amounts of data being gathered from us, and then that data is being used to influence us without our knowledge. And Europe aims to be this hotspot of creating new regulation on the use of data. How do you perceive this? How far can regulation take us, taking into consideration that very few of the world's leading tech and platform giants come from Europe in the first place? Would Alice like to start looking at things from Brussels' perspective?
Yes, sure. I would say that's very tricky indeed, because as we are seeing with the GDPR, which is the European Data Protection Law, regulation stands or falls with how it's enforced. Mm-hmm. And so you need enough resources to enforce, both nationally but also at the European level. And there, it's relevant which, for example, in the case of Europe, the European level enforcement is often held up in Dublin, where a lot of the big tech platforms are based or have their European office. So their business interests play a role, as we also see in Brussels. When I started working in Brussels in 2012, the biggest lobby groups were actually the fossil fuel industry, which I know because I used to work as a climate campaigner, so I know how the lobbyists work and how they manage to delay and obstruct and dilute regulation. But now I think the big tech lobbyists have overtaken the fossil fuel industry in lobbying budgets in Brussels, and they use the same techniques. There's a brilliant book called Merchants of Doubt, which describe how both the tobacco lobby and the fossil fuel lobby and the big tech are, how they work. And so if we really want, and I'm coming back to this underlying problem again with technologies, then so if we really want to address this, then democracies should team up and align their policies and their laws across not just across the Atlantic, but like globally, because the information disorder doesn't stop at the border. And so even though the EU is probably leading in many respects, things like the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and the Code of Practice, they're good steps, but they're far from adequate. And most importantly, they somehow also need to work across, outside of the EU space. So to end, and I'm really so concerned about the role of digital technologies for our democracy. Really, that's my biggest concern. And I truly believe that the only way to solve the underlying systemic crisis is to disrupt the business model of big tech. Because anything else is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Thank you. So, Peter, Jyrki, any thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I'll be positive. I agree with a lot of that. On the positive side, the EU is a regulatory superpower. Where it fails in digital innovation, it does lead in regulation. And what Europe does is then usually followed up by the tech companies in other places, because we just set the standards. I mean, not uniformly. I mean, look at how many moderators Facebook has in Germany, a lot. How many does it have in Vietnam or Burma? Not a lot, because there's no one punishing them for it. So those kind of irregularities are horrific and reveal all sorts of injustices. But the EU does have this incredible power of being a regulatory superpower, and it's easier for the tech companies on some issues at least to sort of just, you know, do whatever the EU does. I think quite right. Very important for the democracies to come together, so we have some baselines. It won't be fully the same regulation, but at least baselines around transparency, algorithmic oversight, what Jamie Susskind, my friend and colleague, calls digital republicanism. That's very important. I do think we have to remember that they're also very, very vulnerable. They seem all powerful, but they're, in America anyway, but also in Europe, they are one line away from the complete destruction of their whole model, which is around liability. Section 320 in the US, which basically says they're not liable for anything on their platform. So you get rid of that one line, and the internet as we know it collapses. So they're kind of these weird titans who are actually, the moment you say, actually guys, you're liable for everything on your platform, boom, the whole thing starts to collapse. And that's what they're fighting over. They're always fighting about who is responsible. It's a very deeply philosophical argument, actually. What is liability? Who has responsibility? Who enforces that responsibility? It really is these deep, deep arguments. So yes, they are frightening. Their power is absurdly big. We have private companies run for private interests, which are dominating our public sphere. I think that's structurally completely wrong. But they're also very vulnerable, so let's not get too scared of them. We can, you know. So yeah, I just want to be positive.
Yeah. Thank you. We always need that.
Yeah.
So
well, if I may say something, first I want to say that I don't want to demonize big tech companies, because they have done remarkable jobs. I mean, internet, social media, etc., and online shopping. So there are lots of positive applications. But the thing is that that those big tech companies have created the rules for themselves. They have created the rules for which are ideal for their own business models. Just like what the biggest oil companies did 100 years ago. So the reason why the US created competition law was it was meant to bust trusts, to limit the use or misuse of dominating market position. That was the origin of competition law. And now we are trying to use the same competition law for limiting the use of power of big tech companies, which are using data. And it's ultimately too slow. That is the reason, and many of those tech companies have accepted that they are given 3 billion euros fine for misusing the dominant market position. It's okay for them. So it's a proof that we need a market regulation. So basically we have a new technology, we have new businesses, and data is the fastest increasing raw material. So we are completely in new situation. And that's why in order to keep up market competition, we need a market regulation. If data is a raw material, as it is, it must be regulated. Just like we regulate wood or minerals or whatever. So that I don't want I repeat, I don't want to demonize the big tech companies, but we don't need to accept the rules they have created for themselves. Individuals and other companies and societies may have an opinion that we need more fair regulatory environment for using our data. Imagine Amazon just bought a cleaning robot company. I don't know whether it's a good business or not, I mean, selling cleaning robots. Maybe it's a good business as such, but they are more interested in data they can produce. They have cameras in their robots. So cameras are scanning our homes. So they can resell the data, what the robots are collecting from our homes. And I believe that this is at least profitable business, selling the data. So it's quite clear that for getting the best out of new technologies and getting best out of data, we need fair market regulation.
And we thought that there's clearly a support, but we thought that Stasi was the worst thing that could happen to surveillance and robotic cameras or vacuum cleaners in our homes is thought that I'm not very comfortable with. But I would like to return to the fact how democracies should respond. And Peter put out the argument already that information wars are a battlefield that's defined by authoritarians, and you brought out a few ways that already we should respond. I mean, there was design and there was participation and so forth. But I would like to get sort of more concrete. I mean, the problem we as democracies have that we haven't been really, I mean, we're just taking it for granted and we've let our institutions deteriorate, or rather we haven't we haven't pushed for reforms. And there's this growing gap between the digital world and the digital human and the institution, the democratic institutions and ways to really practice democracy. So Jyrki and Alice and Peter, I mean, let's get into the more concrete details. I mean, how do we really, I mean, apart from the sort of the things that were already thrown in Peter's speech and what Jyrki, you mentioned that we need that more of that participation and agency, what should decision makers and democratic institutions do? Because they're certainly not doing enough to defend democracy.
Well, yeah, it's true. The world has changed and developed a great deal during the last 100 years. And it has been based on research and development and innovation processes in technologies, etc. But how much we have used resources to rethink democracy. R&D investments to democracy are so little that it's not worth mentioning. So basically we have to concentrate on democratic institutions and how they could participate people better. Because voting every 4th year is not anymore enough. We need more opportunities to influence the decision-making processes, or at least to have a proper discussion platforms, which the social media is not. So, for instance, Sitra is trying to help our regional authorities. We have a new regional body which is taking care of health and social services, to rethink the democratic aspect of this new body. So I believe that participation innovations are the most important thing what the institutions should and could do.
Alice?
Well, we all must take responsibility for democracy. It's really like, it's a bit the same as a marriage. You need to work on it every day. And that's how it works with democracy too. On the other hand, it's also not fair to, to make the individual, the sole responsible. Like, we cannot ask, like, even if we all stop using plastic straws, as an individual, we cannot solve the climate crisis or the environmental crisis. We really need, you may save a turtle, but not the planet on your own. So, and for democracy, and then especially looking at it in the context from what I call hybrid threats to democracy, which is a mix of foreign, domestic, and technological threats. And as you Finns very well know, because you have the Center of Excellence for Hybrid Threats here, a key lesson learned from Ukraine, but also from the Baltics and the Nordics, is that it's crucial to design and implement a whole-of-society response to these hybrid threats, because these threats undermine our societies from all sides and via all sectors. So you cannot tackle them top-down or bottom-up only. And we really need to stand together. The public, the private, and the civic sectors must defend democracy and freedom together.
And more specifically to Peter, I mean, you mentioned already that the media is not doing enough, holding power to account. And I mean, looking at the compromises Europe was ready to make for cheap, comfortable energy, and so forth. What kind of movement or what would you describe? I mean, what would be the movement to hold power into account more efficiently than only media?
I mean, let's take I don't think there's one law, but let's take the example that you gave, and this general problem of sort of high-level corruption, of money that was sort of essentially stolen from places like Russia. Let's focus on Russia as we're in Finland, and there are geopolitical reasons to focus on it right now. And that was sort of, laundered in the West, but also was sort of, created into energy unions, but also many, many different types of business interactions, which, I'm looking for the right word here, it's not always about corruption, but which went towards, in a very intentional way, strengthening democracy, strengthening fascism, strengthening genocidal wars. After 2014 even before 2000, I never really believed the arguments about we will trade in Russia and they will become more democratic. I always thought that was PR bluff. So because I saw it very close up in Moscow, none of the business leaders coming to Moscow cared about democracy. But that was the line. So maybe until 2012, you could tell yourself that. After Putin goes full dictator in 2012, after the invasion of Crimea, after Aleppo, you're still doing business. You are consciously strengthening an actor who wants to destroy the liberal order, return us to a world where all the achievements of the 20th century, achieved through the Holocaust, achieved through the Second World War, are thrown out the window. This very, very conscious decoupling of values, economics, and security has been our great tragedy. So everybody involved in that should feel a level of responsibility. So I don't think it's just about media. Media do wonderful research into corruption. OCCRP is a wonderful network of anti-corruption researchers. They research this, or they might research the social costs of this kind of business practice, and then they'll publish it in The Guardian, and nothing really happens at all. We need something much, much more proactive. I would love to see a civic movement throughout Europe that really targeted the linchpins of the system, both corrupt practices and just practices which are immoral. For example, going back to your, oil equivalent, it wasn't illegal what Shell were doing a lot of the time. It was just deeply, 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 deeply anti-democratic and deeply immoral, with horrible consequences for the environment. So, the Steinmeiers of this world, the Gabriels of this world, this mix of business and political interests that have consciously, intentionally strengthened a genocidal regime in the heart of Europe should be held responsible. And that probably means very, very active civic campaigns that surface their responsibility and that make sure that it can't happen again. I'm not sure media do that. And in a way, this is what Alexei Navalny does inside of Russia, using genuine research, journalistic style research, and then really pushing that towards a social and political effect. We could do that with a lot more power here, and with real costs, because these people do believe in their public business reputation, their public political reputation, and if they have been doing something illegal, then the threat of ending up on a sanctions list would also even worry the deeply smug oligarchs around Viktor Orban, who could well be continuing quite untransparent business dealings with various unsavory states. So, but that's a movement. What I think we need is a very, very strong, popular movement that holds this sort of behavior to account and make sure that there's a cost to it. And again, actually, it's great. I mean, this is what Greenpeace did. They started to raise the costs to big energy companies around what they were doing, and they forced behavioral change and legal change. It's probably not quite the media's role, though. I think it's campaigns and civil society. But I think these men, and they're virtually always men, have to understand that there are costs to furthering the interests of a genocidal regime.
Just a quick follow-up. Are you seeing any signs of this in Europe?
No.
Because, I mean, the initial reaction to the Ukraine...
Complete impunity.
Yeah.
No, the laws change and people adapt, but overall there's no cost. No.
Yeah.
No, they're all swanning around. They're all swanning around European capitals, being kind of quiet and waiting for the moment to force Ukraine into a terrible peace deal and break it.
I'm just going to clarify. I mean, this civil movement, because the initial reaction from the European civil society was quite encouraging.
Yeah, lots of things, lots of amazing things have happened. This has been a sea change, and listening to von der Leyen yesterday, I never thought I'd applaud von der Leyen, but I did. I thought it was a brilliant speech she gave. I think it was the day before yesterday. Really, I think getting to the crux of this issue, that the war in Ukraine is not just about Russia and Ukraine. Russia is at war with us through energy blackmail, through hunger blackmail, through corruption. I mean, I think she really got it. I don't know how deeply that then penetrates into key countries, but I think it was fantastic to see a German leader of the EU really articulating the problem. So there's been a great political reaction, amazing civil society reaction, but what I'm talking about here is something a little bit more front foot, and something that will take courage, because these men, just like the oil companies, are protected by PR companies, often have vast interests in media. In someone like Hungary, it's just physically dangerous to go after Orban's oligarchs. So it's going to take a lot of courage as well.
I'll let Jukka ask the final question of our panel.
Yes, I can notice that we are running out of time here, so maybe a quick final round, a question for all of you. Peter already mentioned Jamie Susskind, and he just happened to visit Finland a few weeks ago, and he said that this traditional saying, personal is political, should now be accompanied with phrase, digital is political. And after this, at least I was left wondering about the relation between digital, political, and personal when it comes to defending democracy. And that's why I'd like to hear, how do you see the relation between individual skills, like information literacy, and the system, which in this case is the hybrid media environment we live in? How much emphasis should we put on the resilience of the individual in relation to the resilience of our democratic society? How do you see this individual society balance in this sense? Who would like to start? Let's make a quick final round, as we have 30 seconds time.
Well, if I then start, first of all, I think we need a regulation because we have a new raw material and new business. Democratically defined regulation. Second, every generation needs to learn democracy again. So we can't outsource individuals' responsibility living in liberal democracies. We have to make sure that everybody knows what is right and what is wrong when living in a liberal democracy. So, and finally, we have to modernize the ways to be a member of liberal democratic societies. So we need new applications to participate.
So, Alice, what do you think?
I would like to just expand a little bit on what I previously said about this whole of society response, so that we each have to do play our role and take our responsibility. So, for example, I think that tech companies should, for technology to strengthen and not weaken democracy, it needs to be co-designed, and that's an approach that I learned doing as philosopher of science and technology. It's going too far to explain the details, but it mainly means that you know, even from the start, even in the design process, you involve many more stakeholders than just the coders and the technologists, but also, for example, sociologists, anthropologists, ethicists, you name it. So it has to be a collective effort to design technology that benefits democracy. Then what the government should do, I have a whole list, but I think it's really, you know, besides democracy, it's also important to realize that these, the way these tech platforms are now designed are costing us billions in lost productivity. And not only that, it's also become a security threat, because this is the let's say the attack surface for example, foreign authoritarian states. So I would just like to ask the governments the question, so if we're not allowing cars without safety belts, why would we allow tech platforms without safety belts? And then the final actor, that's us, citizens. So what can we do? So many things, but let me just, our digital literacy should be much broader even than we're doing it now. For example, let me just, you probably in Finland and the Baltics and the Nordics, you're probably well aware of the saying like, don't feed the trolls. Well, the same goes for algorithms. Don't feed the algorithm. So if, you know, we often say like, yeah, we should fight disinformation. But what does that mean? Because often when, as a social media user, when you reply or like literally fight by engaging with content, the unintentional result is actually that you help the algorithm make it even more salient. So there's lots of tips and tricks I can talk about for hours. We have a training called Act on Disinfo that goes into all those tips, but yeah, so wrapping up, you know, we all have to play our part, and we can only do it together.
I'll try to be succinct, or else I'm going to miss my flight. Again, I do want to always bring it back to sort of the underlying sort of debates here, and there's a very strong strain that says that what the digital age has revealed is that we are such things as data is made of. Yeah? That we are just bits of our own data. That our data knows more about us than we do. There's even a very good philosopher, Luciano Floridi, at Oxford, who talks about how the internet and the data age has revealed that what we thought was our rational minds isn't. It's actually like the discovery of the subconscious, the discovery of our data selves. That's our true selves. We're not actually in control. It's our data through which we understand people. Harari makes a very, very similar claim. Lots of people in Silicon Valley say this, like the singularity. You know, we need to dissolve into our data, and the computer will decide the best society. I think it's the opposite way around. I think actually we begin at the point where our data can't work us out. There are actually lots of things that data can do. It can like get you great things on Amazon, and you know, you can use there's a really good innovation that's come out with sort of a data gathering thing of your feces, which as you poo will analyze as you live whether you're getting any nasty diseases. Amazing. I'm glad for that. I think public health can be, you know, that's somewhere I want to share my data with to improve public health. That's great. But I think you as a personality, you as a person begin where data fails. And there's a lovely book called Zed by Joanna Kavanagh, which I think is the 1984 of our era, which is a comedy about a society where ruled by kind of data oligarchs who try to predict everything and use people's data to design the ideal society and people's personal relationships. And it's a comedy, and the main character is a Mark Zuckerberg character who's using these vast amounts of data to find himself the ideal girlfriend. And however hard he tries, he completely fails, because data can't predict love, and it can't predict happiness, and everybody in the society is deeply, deeply unhappy. So I think it's the opposite. Jamie's a friend of mine, and I love him dearly. But I'd say, actually, our personality begins at the point where data fails, point that data cannot reach. That's where the new definition of the human is, and that's why both the gurus of Silicon Valley and of the Chinese Communist Party will fail.
This big thought.